And we can we'll now look in the first pillar, and it is linked to a so-called question. So what heart rate should I run or train at to burn fat or to build endurance? And here it's important to distinguish that intensity is the key factor that is required to target specific training adaptations that we are looking for. If we can do that, we can essentially train to make any plan tailor for ourselves. And as we increase intensity of the exercise, the body changes the way it sources energy. So at low intensity, as mentioned, body primarily uses oxygen to convert fats into energy. That process is slow, so we're only using it when we are going somewhat slow. But again, that is relative, because as we improve our strength and as we improve our ability to process fats, we improve the hemoglobin, myoglobin, all of that. That intensity, actually, that speed that is low intensity for us gets quite high. So for one person, a low intensity might be a walk. For an elite level marathoner who runs a marathon in, I don't know, 2:15, for example, for them, low intensity is 4 minutes per kilometers, which is a 20-minute 5K. And actually, there aren't too many people who can run a 5K in under 20 minutes. But again, that is because they have built all of those other adaptations over the year. And at high intensity, the body needs energy fast, and the energy system switches from fats and focuses more on converting carbohydrates, sugar or stored glycogen, into energy instead. This doesn't require oxygen, which is why it's called anaerobic mode. And for a moment, those two actually operate at the same time. And when we go into really top end, that's sort of 8 to 10 second efforts. For them, we actually use stored energy inside our muscles. So it has been developed kind of historically so that we are able to run away from the scene. Even when we're super tired, we can always find the energy to run those 5 or 10 seconds. So basically, different intensities trigger different adaptations in the bodies, and if we control those, we can control the results that we achieve. And that's where different zones come into play. They simply help to categorize that intensity. And to simplify this whole heart rate training situation, again, coming back to the lactate and the fact that it's the true measure of intensity, there are 2 points at in our sort of exercise, or in the way we're exercising. And there's aerobic threshold and there's anaerobic threshold. And if you would imagine yourself on a treadmill, where at every minute the speed is increased linearly, so every minute your speed is being increased by, let's say, 0.3 or 0.5 kilometers per hour. At first it would be a very slow walk, but then it would become a jog, a run, and then the sprint until you're fully exhausted. And your lactate would basically be represented with this line. At first, as you see, it would go slightly down, then it would go slightly up, and then it would skyrocket, as we discussed earlier. And aerobic threshold is actually the intensity level after which the body starts to slowly accumulate lactate. The effort at this point of time are not hard, as mentioned. That's still considered low intensity. But if you notice, before this aerobic threshold, the lactate actually comes down, and that's what I mentioned, that the body is using lactate that we have to kind of support itself and use it for energy, which is why the zone 1, everything under aerobic threshold, is used for recovery. So we're processing that lactate, we're processing the fatigue that we have, and that lactate can be from walking up the stairs or going just, I don't know, going for a 30-minute walk, or just out of stress. We also tend to tense up, and that's when the lactate can be visible. And then after aerobic threshold, the lactate grows until the anaerobic threshold. And anaerobic threshold happens somewhere between the lactate level of 2 and let's say 3.5, maybe 4 of millimole per liter. And at this point of time, lactate starts to accumulate quickly. And this symbolizes the part when the energy system switches completely to anaerobic mode. So up until aerobic threshold, it was all of the energy was used from fat, and then here everything from sugar, and in between, kind of, it depends. At the beginning, it's probably some 10 or 20%. Towards the end, it's maybe around 80 or 90, something like this. But more importantly, after the anaerobic threshold, that's when the body muscles cannot deal with that muscle fatigue anymore, and that's when our body starts to shut down essentially, and we're only able to maintain a few minutes of that exercise. And this is, again, as mentioned, where the zones come into place. We cannot really target, or we cannot measure lactate on every training session. That's simply impossible. And even for those who have the tools, it's quite costly, because the lactate monitor costs, I don't know, 400 euros. And then you would need a lot of these additional strips where you need to always take a blood from the finger or from an ear, and it's unhygienic, so it's not practical. But since it correlates with the heart rate, there are quite a lot of research made, and there are various patterns that show up for these zones. And even though there are concerns that zones are not these estimated zones are not precise, it's still much better than training without any recollection of where my heart rate is. So if we talk about zones, there are actually quite several different methods how they are split. There are some who use 4-zone approach, there are some who use 5, there are some who use 7. 5 is the most popular one, and I split 5th zone here further. So actually this is kind of a 7-zone methodology applied to a 5-zone methodology. And kind of roughly to jump through it is zone 1 is a light effort. It's used for active recovery, and you can see here that it promotes the essentially blood flow, and simply used for primarily recovery. Or if we talk about base building, then we need to go really long there. We need to go 2 or 3 hours at least to get a training benefit. And obviously for running or impact sports, that's not possible. But if we talk about kayaking, cross-country skiing, cycling, that's a way how to grow the aerobic base. Then we have zone 2. That's your comfortable, easy effort. You can easily speak 1 or 2 full sentences at once. Typically, you would be able to breathe through your nose, and that's another good good way to check if you're in the correct zone, is by measuring how you breathe and how you're able to speak. And zone 2 is your aerobic pace. That's your easy pace, and that should cover most of your training. And the reason, which I just mentioned, is because the most efficient way to build endurance is to stay here closer to aerobic threshold, and in that way to kind of stimulate the body to produce more mitochondria. because endurance is not built by going hard. Endurance is built actually by going just a little bit harder or longer than you're able to, but still on the easier side. And sometimes maybe you have noticed, if you're, for example, going for a 1 hour run, towards the end of the 1 hour run or cycle, your heart rate starts to climb up at the same effort. That is that kind of training effect that is happening. And typically, we will discuss how to create a plan slightly later, but for now, kind of think of the zone 2 as the way to build general endurance and kind of mitochondria and efficiency. Zone 3 is a moderate effort. You need kind of your breathing gets a little bit deeper. Typically, breathing out through your nose gets harder. So to remove carbon dioxide, you start to exhale through your mouth, and it develops these, as I mentioned already, the capillaries throughout the body, and that's your typically a race intensity of 3 to 6 hour race, and that's called also a tempo effort. So it is kind of, you feel like you're exercising, but you can go on theoretically 4 hours when you are in condition to do so. Zone 4 is where it gets harder. So zone 3 is still moderate intensity, but zone 4 and up, that's the high intensity part. And on the lower end, it's you're able to speak a few words. On the higher end, so in zone 5, you actually cannot mumble anything. So you're simply breathless and you're gasping for air. And zone 4, as I already mentioned, it builds so-called aerobic or threshold power. That is how much power you can apply to your stride or to your stroke or your pedal turn while you're still operating aerobically by using oxygen. And for a longer distance events, that's actually the key to improving your speed. So all of the kind of intervals that are targeted at improving your half marathon or marathon pace, they shouldn't be done at your maximum effort, but they should be done closer to your threshold effort, which is within zone 4. And then we have zone 5, and it further split into kind of 3 different parts. One is that is closer to a threshold value. That's so-called VO2 max. That's the what we can produce while we still use oxygen. And then we go into anaerobic capacity. That's how we process lactate. And then 5th one is essentially the neuromuscular power and speed training. Yeah, so how to determine those zones? There's a formula. There are several formulas, but I found the formula that is developed by a Finnish researcher under the surname Karvonen tends to be the most precise one, because it is it's based on thousands of lab tests of different people, and it is used as an average. Obviously, most precise way to determine your zone is to take the lab test. They would take the lactate. They would kind of determine what's your heart rate. They would also place a mask. They would see how the amount of carbon dioxide you breathe out is changing, and based on that, they would determine aerobic and anaerobic threshold, and they would tell you precisely what's your zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Since that is not possible for most of the people, they are better off to either estimating it via formula, using a perceived exertion scale, which I briefly touched upon, but we will get slightly more into it, or if a person is a high-level athlete, they actually use the power or lactate pace or lactate power. So the FTP, functional threshold power, for example, or lactate pace. That's the pace of your threshold effort, which is a 1 hour effort. And this is where we get into slightly more detail. Some of you might have read about the maximum heart rate on my blog post as well. Not to bore you too much with it. Maximum heart rate is basically the maximum amount of heartbeats that a heart does in 1 minute, and it's kind of a benchmark for maximum output. It can vary significantly from person to person. A high or low maximum heart rate is neither good or bad. It's just what a person is born with. Women and younger people tend to have slightly higher maximum heart rates, meaning their zones would also be slightly different. Some, I don't know, typically 5 to 10 10 beat higher than men. And there are 3 different formulas that I know of. You might know the 2020 minus H is the most common one. But then people who are aged 60, for example, if they have been active, according to formula, they would have a maximum heart rate of 160, whereas in reality, many of them would have their maximum heart rate in 170s, maybe even 180s. And here, important to note is that if you consistently go to kind of higher heart rates, your body sort of adjusts to it and allows you to get to those higher heart rates. Whereas if you haven't trained in at high intensity, then you wouldn't be able right away to get to your maximum heart rate, because the body will shut down faster in order to prevent this over acidity. So there is a common question: can I go over my estimated maximum heart rate? And the answer is yes, and that is because formula generalizes people, and which is why I tend to use this second formula as a theoretical maximum if we don't know better. But then as I work more with people, we look into kind of how they perform at specific heart rate, how the body feels, and that way we map it to certain zones, and then we can kind of align that together. And as you already noticed, there are tons of different variables that go into heart rate training, and they cannot be standardized from one person to another person. Some might have lower hemoglobin and will need more beats per minute to basically maintain the same efficiency. Some will have different maximum heart rate, which would also impact kind of at which heart rate value their kind of specific effect would take place. And as my sports doctor always said, it's the dynamics that is important, and not necessarily kind of looking what others are doing. So how things have changed throughout the weeks or months or years, and basically use that. What I will notice is that if you set a too low of maximum heart rate benchmark, then basically you will be under exerting yourself on every sessions and not getting the optimal result. That said, there are a few tests that you can do. I generally don't advise to do them right away when you start a training program, but once you have some weeks or even months under your belt, it makes sense to do some field tests to just cross-check whether your zones are aligned and then whether basically things are where they should be. One is that there's a partner-assisted maximum test. I have it on my blog post about the maximum heart rate as well. It's basically when you wear the heart rate monitor and then you give your watch to your partner, and then he or she rides a bike with you, and every half a minute you basically start running few beats higher. So 3 beats, then 3 beats, then 3 beats. He just mentions what beats you have so that you can focus on it, and then until you can no longer increase or um, your muscles shut down. Another maximum heart rate is a 4-minute all-out test. You can do 4 times 2 minutes with 1 minute recovery. You can just do 20 minutes all out. There's a lot of different variants how you can get yourself to a to the end of your capacity. You can test kind of how VO2 max works in practice for you. While you won't be able to calculate how much oxygen you use, VO2 max is essentially the intensity you can sustain for roughly 12 minutes, maybe 15 of all-out effort, and that's your low zone 5. It's called there's a 12-minute test. It's called the Cooper test. So basically how far you go in a 12-minute effort. And the next time you do that test, if you would go further, then that means kind of your VO2 max has increased. So you're able to use oxygen at maximum capacity more effectively. But for longer duration, there is, for endurance sports in particular, the threshold effort is a more relevant one. So basically you go for roughly 45 to 60 minutes of all-out effort. Threshold is your 60 minutes all-out, but 45 minutes would get you quite close as well. And that would be your high zone 4. And another test is easy pace. You just go out for 1 hour and you turn on your heart rate monitor, but you don't pay close attention. And then after that, you compare how that compares to your zones that you have calculated, and that should be within your zone 2. I kind of where professionals train, they don't use very often the heart rate monitors because they train by effort, they train by feel. They know their body so well that they know how it feels and how each particular effort should look like. And even though they train by pace, they do it, when they train by pace, they do it when they know they're fully recovered and they're able to use it to make actual relevant conclusions. And kind of it comes from this so-called effort training, and there is a rate of perceived exertion table where you rate how you feel the effort on a scale from 1 to 10. 1 being very light and 10 being maximum effort you're running from a bear or something. And each of the efforts correlates to a certain zone and correlates also to how your body feels. So for example, we talked about zone 2. It's kind of easy, comfortable, so kind of you are aware that you are breathing, but you can still do it through your nose, and you can still say a sentence or maybe even few. And then as it gets harder, breathing and talking progressively gets harder. So for example, when we talk about high zone 4, which is your threshold effort, you're essentially, if you are to say a few words, you would be gasping for air. You're not able to maintain a proper conversation because you would be able to only, ask some 3-4 words or something like this, and in exchange explain that. So it's quite hard, but it's hard which you can maintain for an hour, for example, in a race environment. And this is highly individual. This is kind of, it can be imprecise if your pain threshold is too high, for example, or you're not really listening to your body and instead have this ego principle going over it, which means that it's good to be aware of it, but if you're able to cross-check it against technology, that would be the best way. So, for example, or I know that my zone 2 for a run is somewhere between 130 and 145, and if I'm running, I feel okay, I'm kind of breathing comfortably, but then I see, I don't know, my heart rate is 150, which sometimes happens. And then I have two options. I can think of it I can ignore it, and kind of my ego can take over that. Oh, I'm okay. I know better. I'm feeling everything is easy, and that's okay. Or I can actually slow down and give the body exactly what it needs.